Canterbury Tales, namely The Wife of Baths, her prologue and her tale. In those, I hope to establish the exemplary strength shown by these leading ladies as they encounter, maneuver within, and succeed in their respective patriarchal environments. So we'll turn first to the Book of Esther, where we compare Vashti and Esther's dilemmas and these women's decisions. And then in the next paper this evening, we'll explore the Christian woman in Peter's congregation who, in modeling Christian virtues, might convert her unbelieving husband. And then finally, we'll highlight the wife of Bath's opinions towards marriage, the virtuous wife and husband. Now, an analysis of this collage, I hope you will find, supports my contention that the virtuous wife exercises her agency to benefit others and to maintain her honor. These stories share a theme of reversal, as the one without social power, that is the wife, gains the moral high ground, succeeds in achieving her will, and, with the exception of Vashti, persuades her husband to a better course. These stories also highlight the power of resilience, especially Esther's story, and that assumed by Peter in his portrait of the believing wife married to the unbelieving husband. Kenneth Ginsburg has a theory, the 7 C's, and I mean the letter C. It's the 7 C's of resilience, and it offers us some language that we can use to see resiliency in these stories. The 7 C's include competence, confidence, connection to others, character, contribution to the group, coping with challenges, and control of outcomes through good decisions. Now, granted, Ginsburg's focus is children. But as I read that list, I was struck anew that all I really need to know, I learned in kindergarten. So let's turn to the Book of Esther. This text exists in 3 ancient forms: Hebrew, the Septuagint, and the Alpha text. An examination of the issues surrounding the 2 Greek texts and their relationship to the MT continues to impact scholarship. However, for my purposes, our study of Vashti and Esther will draw on the Hebrew, the MT text, with a slight turn into the Septuagint, just because I found some really good art on an episode that happens there. Not only is the textual history of the book a mare's nest, but scholars strenuously debate the text's genre. Karen Jobes, in her Esther commentary, rightly reminds us that narrative and history can play complementary roles within the text. Quote, "Like other stories in the Bible, the book of Esther portrays history with all of the artistry of great literature." End quote. A major theme within the book is that of reversal. And then an additional structural element is banquet scenes. Irony and exaggeration, they abound through this story. The historical setting of the Book of Esther is Susa, the location of King Xerxes I's winter palace. We know much of King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, who ruled in 486 to 465 BC. We learn about him especially from Herodotus's History of the Persian Wars that was composed about 25 years after the events of Xerxes' reign. Now, about 50 years before Xerxes' rule, Jews exiled in Babylon were invited to return to Jerusalem by the new Persian ruler, Cyrus the Great. Some returned, and we hear their stories in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, as we open the book of Esther, we meet the king throwing a lavish multi-day banquet, celebrating and displaying his wealth and power. His queen, Vashti, hosts a smaller banquet for the women of the court. And after 7 days of drinking, the king orders 7 eunuchs to bring his wife to the all-male venue. And she refuses. The king is enraged. This affront sets in motion a discussion about what might be done, with the king's advisors counseling that a law be decreed that all wives must always obey their husbands. Vashti disappears from the narrative here. She's vanished from the king's presence. But Vashti, I think, should not be passed over too quickly. Often her story is read as an exemplar, but as Job points out, such an approach is, quote, inadequate and misleading. For the text does not, end quote, for the text does not preach the evils of alcohol or of insubordinate wives. Instead, the text itself implies that the excessive drinking prompted this command to Vashti. Vashti's character is often understood in comparison to Esther's more developed persona. And this seems unsatisfactory to me, as the dilemma each wife faced is so different. Vashti is given a direct public order by her husband, the king. Esther privately approaches the king with a request. The king's command to Vashti was time-stamped. Come now. Her options were limited to going to him or staying at her banquet. The story does not suggest that Vashti was surprised at her fate, for the king's reaction to just dismiss her forever from the palace. I think that could have been expected, maybe predictable. So she knew that her no could bring her exile from the palace, or worse. At stake, though, for her was her own future, including her dignity. But Esther, by contrast, carried the fate of her people in her encounters with the king. The text is silent about why Vashti did not come to the king. Assuming that she made a reasonable decision, what factors would she have weighed? Scholars point to the pattern described by Plutarch in his Moralia, wherein Persian wives ate with their husbands at banquets, but were then excused at the meal's conclusion, and concubines and dancing girls were brought in as the wine flowed. Now, Vashti may have concluded that whether or not she went to the king, her time as queen had ended. For to appear before him and his men in the company of concubines, that would have humiliated her in her royal position. Was the king so drunk as to not realize this? Or did he set her up to fail with this impossible demand? Well, I don't know, but maybe the former, right? Because he's not characterized as having much, if any, forethought as you read the whole book. The story establishes the king's character as egotistical, impulsive, and easily led by others. And these traits seem to play a role then in Esther's strategy to save her people, which we'll turn to in a moment. But there are negative views of Vashti. George Lawson, who was writing in 1804, he has more confidence in the king's judgment and less in Vashti's character. He concludes that Vashti's famous beauty is paired with great pride and selfishness. Even more, he says she could have sent a polite note to the king asking that her modesty be preserved, and, quote here, "It is entirely possible that he would have rescinded his request." Kings were different in the 1800s. I guess that's the lesson here. Eschewing the possibility that her modesty is at stake, we jump forward here to 1958, and in the Interpreter's Bible, it applauds the king's advisors for, quote, "If other wives of lesser rank follow the example of the defiant queen, an empire will be thrown into anarchy." So women were much more powerful in the 1950s than clearly we are today. There's a lot of implied lessons here. More recently, Ian Duguid presents an exemplar reading coupled with typology wherein Xerxes represents Christ the King and represents the principle of headship in the home and church. Vashti represents the disobedient wife. You know, I do this research for you so that you don't have to do this, okay? I can hear some of the gasps. Soldiering on. Vashti represents the disobedient wife who, quote, suffering freed no one, not even herself, and was ultimately a foolish gesture, end quote. It seems an odd judgment, as she was not asked to save anyone, and nor was anyone in danger. Moreover, many would hold that one's dignity is beyond price and is worth preserving, even if it means losing worldly goods and position. I mean, this is Mordecai's opinion, when later he refuses to bow to Haman and sets off another empire-wide edict. Jean-Daniel Macchi concludes, quote, like Vashti, Mordecai disobeys a royal order in refusing to pay homage to an individual whose functions are similar to those of a king. Like her, he cannot preserve his dignity without opposing the law of the empire, end quote. In sum, Vashti's agency in disobeying the king's order, which is also interpreted as a command of a husband to his wife, is alternatively vilified and celebrated. Joe Carruthers accurately describes the dilemma. Here's a long quote here. Because of commentators' concurrent desires both to condemn Vashti's culture as immoral, so the Persian culture as immoral, and in so doing, making her actions defendable, and yet these commentators condemn female disobedience, rendering her actions inexcusable, readings are perversely contradictory, as Vashti is vindicated for her modesty, but condemned for her disobedience, end quote. Yet all agree that Vashti made her own decision, in contrast to her husband, who was undisciplined in his command, overreactive in his response, and led passively by his advisors. Michael Fox summarizes, quote, surely the author is smirking at his spokesman for the wise men of Persia for his pomposity, his hysterical interpretation of a trivial incident, his nervous concern about female powers, and his self-defeating wisdom, end quote. Esther fills the vacancy left by Vashti's dismissal. She enters the story as one of many young virgins who are taken to the palace for the king to choose his wife. I'll go through 5 scenes here. The first scene describes this process. The second scene focuses on the king's acceptance of Esther, which leads to her being crowned queen. The third scene features the third scene featuring Esther follows the central crisis of the book, namely Haman's edict signed by the king to exterminate all Jews in the empire. In Esther's fourth scene, she puts her 2-day plan into action. And the fifth scene reveals the success of her plan, the defeat of Haman, and the rescue of the Jews. For each scene, we will look closely at Esther's agency, and we'll discover her confidence, one of the C's, an independent decision-making, and see how that grows as the story unfolds. So the first scene, preparing the virgin for the king. Yes, I chose a Disney slide. Because Xerxes' sexual appetite was well known, and it's actually hard to find what I would consider a decent and appropriate slide to put up here in artwork. So I went with Disney. Herodotus speaks of Xerxes' sexual appetite. We meet Esther, Hadassah, in chapter 2, verse 7. She's part of an empire-wide search to find beautiful young virgins. Esther is an orphan. She's being raised by her cousin Mordecai. She's being raised in Susa. I mention this to remind us that not only did Esther suffer the trauma of exile, but she lost both parents at a young age. Moreover, she does not reveal that she's Jewish because Mordecai has asked her not to, has told her not to. That he continues to visit the courtyard outside the harem suggests that he is worried about Esther's fate. And, that's a reasonable fear given what happened to Vashti. The king's commissioners took, and we don't know how forcefully in all cases, they took many girls, including Esther, to the palace. None signed up for a beauty contest. The 12 months of beauty treatments should be taken as evidence, not that these 12 months all played out the way that it was described, as much as the narrator's efforts to show the extravagance that is characteristic of Xerxes' reign. Moreover, we should not assume that she enjoyed the process. What the text does say is that the eunuch in charge, Haggai, had a favorable opinion of her. And from this, I think we should assume she was a pleasant person. It's also clear that the goal is to make her sexually attractive and pleasing to the king. And then comes her day to meet the king. She accepts the advice of the king's eunuch as to what she should bring with her. Is it fair to say that Esther is passive here? Ingratiating? I think it's better to think about her as young, as someone who is hiding her identity and who is isolated in a harem. She follows advice from trusted adults, her cousin and the head eunuch. I think she makes prudent decisions based on her minimal level of agency. She uses what Marion Taylor calls, quote, the arts of alternative resistance, end quote. In fact, Taylor compares the descriptions of Christ's anguish at his arrest, trial, and death with Esther's likely anguish at being taken from her cousin and, quote, being prepared to sleep with an intemperate womanizer, Xerxes, end quote. She goes so far as to say, Esther here is a type of Christ. Her night with the king leads to a crown. Xerxes favors her above all other virgins and holds a banquet in her honor as she becomes queen. She initially is in touch with Mordecai, for he tells her of a plot against the king that he hears while he is outside the palace. This incident will play an ironic role. It's a reversal of fortune later in the story. But at this point, as queen, it seems that she has less access to the outside world and few interactions with Mordecai. A few years go by, and then Haman makes his edict. By this time, she has even less connection with Mordecai, and that sets the stage for our next scene. It might seem unbelievable to us today that Esther could be unaware of Haman's plan to exterminate her people, the Jews. However, we have a story that is told by Herodotus, and it's about, I think, a similar situation wherein a young queen is fearful to discover whether the man she's sleeping with is in fact an impostor, whether the king is an impostor. So Herodotus describes a coup wherein the king's son is killed and an impostor took the throne. A Persian noble, Otanus, sent word, Otanus, I threw a T in there. Otanus sent word to his daughter, Phaedume, who was married to the king's son, whether the man she is laying with now is in fact the king's son. she could not identify who she laid with. So her father then asked her to speak with the sister of the king's son. But Phedume replied, she's been isolated from all others in the palace. She can't speak to the sister or any of the other women of that rank. Well, then her father reminds her of her noble birth and her duty to obey him. She tells her to feel the head of the man she sleeps with, to see if he has ears, as the impostor had his ears cut off. They have such good stories back then. She tells her father she will do it, though it may cost her her life, should this man wake up while she's touching his head. Well, as you probably guessed, the man in bed had no ears. Otanes led his fellow noblemen against the traitor. All ends well. But notice that Phedume was isolated from other women like herself. She had limited information about the outside world, and she lived in fear that an improper step could lead to violence against her. So too, we can imagine Esther sequestered from almost everyone, having only a few eunuchs and some women to attend her, and Hathach, the chief eunuch, assigned to her. And we should remember that no one else in the palace knows that she's Jewish. So there'd be little reason to tell her of Haman's edict. She should not be faulted, in other words, for not knowing of Haman's edict and the peril that now faces her people. I suggest that Esther demonstrates agency and strength of character in ordering Hathach to speak with Mordecai so that she can know why he's in sackcloth. Mordecai's answer includes an explanation of the situation and an order for her to go before the king and beg for mercy. We should pause here to note that Esther will not follow these orders. She discerns that this plan has little chance of success based on her knowledge of the king's volatile character. So she explains her disagreement with this plan by reminding Mordecai that no one can enter the king's presence without being summoned. And she tells him something that he would not have known, namely that she's not been to the king in a month. Mordecai's response to her for such a time as this, you know that very famous line. His response could be taken as either encouragement or chastisement. But I think it also indicates his changed position. For when she was first taken to the harem, he instructs her to keep her identity a secret. Now she needs to make it known. So Esther's response is to command him to gather all the Jews in Susa for a 3-day fast, and then she will go to the king. Mordecai follows her orders. And she accepts the consequence that she might be put to death in her attempt to save her people. We will see a similar sentiment in 1 Peter, when the apostle encourages wives not to be fearful as they stand faithful in their witness. Perhaps it is here in Esther's story that her resiliency shines brightest. If resiliency is the ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties, then she absorbs the terrible news of mortal danger facing her people with incredible resilience. In fact, she models faithful resiliency as she prays and fasts. The banquets. Esther's plan unfolds over 2 days. She sizes up the king, recognizing that he is persuaded by effusive praise and attention. She proceeds accordingly with entering into the inner court with royal regalia to honor his status and obsequiousness to placate his ego. He receives her and he invites her to make a request. Now, this is an addition here. This is from the Septuagint. When she goes, and this is Tintoretto, Esther faints. In this, there's an additional scene, or there's another scene not mentioned in the Hebrew, where she's just overcome and she faints, and the king helps her. And so, God changed the spirit of the king to gentleness, and in intense feeling, he sprang off his throne and took her into his arms until she recovered. I just thought the art was nice, so I wanted to throw that in there for you. Okay. So Esther invites the king and Haman to a special banquet she prepared that night. He agrees and orders an attendant to bring Haman, for the king wishes to do what Esther asks. There's no little irony here, as one reflects back to the banquet in chapter 1. There, it seems the wife was to do what the husband asked. During this banquet, Esther asks the king that he and Haman come to a second banquet the following day. And at that time, she would answer the king's question, which was, "What is your request?" Is Esther manipulating the king? Well, Esther does not deceive the king. She's not unscrupulous. She never controls his ability to refuse. I was thinking about this. She's not like Jacob, who deceives his father Isaac for a blessing. She's not like Abraham, who unscrupulously pawned his wife twice to save his own skin, and in the process made money. She's not like Joseph, who planted money in his brothers' bags, falsely accusing them and frightening them. So is she manipulating the king? I don't think so. I think Esther understands the king's thinking patterns, what he values, and tries to persuade him. She shapes her request around the king's values, which are not necessarily her own. Well, others have said, is Esther too self-effacing before the king, especially the whole faint thing? When she falls at his feet to ask that a new edict be created, well, the fainting and then again in the, when she asks the king if the new edict can be created that nullifies the existing one written by Haman. Does she diminish herself to make the king seem very important? Well, I mean, he is king of a vast empire, and her request is an empire-wide request. Esther's plan has to have two outcomes. She has to defeat Haman and his edict. So the magnitude of her requests require the engagement of the king, even at, I think, a personal level. So Esther creates a scenario that would expose Haman suddenly. And that causes his fatal move. Now the king is completely convinced of Esther's position. This reminded me of the prophet Nathan telling a story to King David about a stolen lamb. And David reacts with great indignation. His deep immersion into the story creates his subsequent deep repentance. You know, this story from 2 Samuel 12. I think so too, Esther creates a setting to convince the king of her position. And Esther's request is granted. She utterly defeats Haman and is given his estate. This estate, then, she gives to Mordecai, which is a gracious gift, worthy of a beneficent queen. Mordecai is promoted to wear the king's signet ring, and Mordecai enacts a new edict which effectively overrules Haman's. But this is not the end of the story. Esther continues to make decisions, demonstrate agency, now with perhaps more troubling requests to the king. In answer to his question about whether she has further petitions, she asks that Haman's 10 sons should be publicly impaled. They're already dead, but she wants them publicly displayed. And she asks that within Susa, that a second day be given to the Jews to slaughter their enemies. Now, her request could be in response to reports from Susa that hostility remains against the Jews and that Haman's larger family seek revenge. If so, then Esther's request to expose Haman's sons' bodies and allow another day for Jews to attack their enemies reflect, one could say, maybe the harsh realities of conflict. However, David Firth observes that King David exposed Saul's sons, and Yahweh responded to his prayer only after Ritzpah showed great fidelity in insisting the bodies were buried. And Firth concludes, quote, "We may have an example of an ethical irony in the book of Esther. so that at the point where Persians become Jews, Jews begin to act like Persians, end quote. I end our discussion on Esther with this sobering note. Although the book of Esther ends with her official acts as queen and declaring Purim festival for the Jews, but her answers to the final requests of the king highlight that with growing agency comes increased power and the challenge to use both well. So in conclusion, Vashti and Esther are married to the same man sequentially. The narrative reveals his character, the king's character, in his distasteful command to Vashti and his intemperate response to her failure to obey it. Esther has the advantage of this knowledge and bases her requests to Xerxes on his susceptible nature. This strategy results in the reversal of her enemy's plans and his final demise. In each of these cases, the two women's agency and their resulting actions upend, reverse, even transform expected events and social norms. I would say these women are the heroes in the text, at least in my telling. And most would agree that even Vashti takes the high moral ground, and that each of these women's agency, however, has been called into question. Vashti rebelling against her husband, Esther conniving her to get her way with Xerxes. Women demonstrating agency can have that effect on some. But I hope I have demonstrated that these texts are better read as endorsing, encouraging, and applauding women's agency. These women are studies in resiliency. Thank you.
Hello? We now have a question and answer session, and so I would like to invite people in person here. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring by the microphone. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question to Dr. Kowick. And for those of you who are online, we have also a way for you to ask questions. We ask that you go to the Facebook page of North Park if you're not there already, and under the video tab, there's a comment section for the live stream. Please type in your question in the comment section, and then Dr. Nate Clayton will read your question live during this time directly to Dr. Kowick to answer. So we have until about 7:15-ish or so for time. So it's a good 30 minutes for Q&A. And who would like to ask the first question? I invite those either online or in person for their queries. Yes, okay, please. And please do introduce yourself and ask.
Dr. Kowick, thank you very much. That was a really wonderful talk. My name's Rich Dippolito. I'm here with my wife, Kelly. My question is about Esther's decision to have two banquets. I've always been puzzled by that. And the only thing I came up with is that strategic, where she's just thinking, just trying to disarm them a little bit and make them feel comfortable. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think she's trying to build, certainly for Haman, he's very comfortable, trying to build up the suspense. I mean, it's suspense for the reader, of course, so that when that moment comes and Haman is shocked, the one act that really gets him into trouble is he pleads with Esther, so he kind of falls on the couch, and the king then comes in at that moment, right? You'll even accost my wife, and they immediately cover his head. So I think it's designed to have this amazing reversal. And I think she knows the character of both men so well, they'll just react in surprise and hopefully then in the ways that she can capitalize on. So that's why I think she does the two. Yeah, to kind of set him up. And of course, she doesn't know this, but Haman is so egotistical, and he's so frustrated that that Mordecai is not paying attention to him properly, that's when he builds the gallows. And then, he's, in a sense, digging his own grave, to mix metaphors there. So I think the narrator kind of builds the suspense for us in this. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. While people are thinking through what questions they would like to ask Dr. Kowick, I hope I'll take the moderator's privilege to ask a question myself. So I'm fascinated by the Septuagint account, especially the fainting scene. And I'm wondering do you think the Septuagint makes more explicit Esther's agency because God actually intervenes and changes the heart of the king and makes him favorable to her? How would you interpret the Septuagint's way of highlighting agency and compare it to the Hebrew or Masoretic text?
Oh, that is such a great question, Max. I did not study it.
Oh, yeah.
I started getting into, that's the next paper.
Okay.
I started getting into the work and trying to line up almost like parallel accounts of the Septuagint, the Alpha text, and then the Hebrew, and realized it almost would be its own paper. So that's why I just chose I'm going to go with the Masoretic. But yeah, I do think you're right that the Septuagint brings in God in a way that the Hebrew is comfortable not. But then the Alpha text does some crazy things also. Yeah, yes, so I just made the decision for this work to focus just on one text in their picture. But it's an excellent question to think about.
Thank you. Questions from the audience or online? Or maybe from other faculty? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Meredith Nyberg. I've been an adjunct professor here at the seminary. I was just curious about vulnerability of these two women, Vashti and then Esther, with men. It's kind of an interesting, that Vashti refused to sort of be vulnerable in front of the men, and Esther ends up being vulnerable in front of Haman, and then her husband rescues her. Have you thought about that at all?
Yes, okay. So how if I'm tracking with you with your question, highlighting the fact that even though both are queen, nevertheless, their position is quite vulnerable because the king has absolute authority to take away the crown, and no one would dispute that or come to their aid with that. With your question about Vashti being vulnerable, can you kind of repeat that so that I get what you mean with Vashti's?
Well, I was just thinking about, here they're sort of at these banquets, right? Because there are banquets all over Esther. Yes. But then, the queen, Vashti, refuses to come in and be in a vulnerable position before all the men. Whereas, it's only Haman kind of representing sort of all the men that would be at the first banquet with the king. So I don't know, I just thought it was an interesting contrast.
Yes. I had not thought of Vashti coming in to be in front of the men in the men's banquet as her being vulnerable. That's very interesting. I've looked at it more as her refusing to be an object. She's to come in and wear her crown, and some later interpreters say just only the crown, that it's definitely, very explicitly sexualized. That vulnerability would, it's her honor that would be vulnerable, and she refuses to be put in that place. Yes, I guess with Esther, you're right in condemning Haman. She has to set the stage well enough. She has to have that personal connection with the king, which she has tried to build over these 2 days. there I would say she's experiencing the vulnerability. They're both vulnerable, but I also would say I think they both recognize what it's going to cost them. So you know, yes, oh, it is. To compare and contrast them, they both, there's so much at stake, and I feel like especially for Vashti, she can't win. Whereas for Esther, at least there's a chance that she can win. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's taken me some time to just let the dust settle and to really, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much for your paper. So kind of, I'm Sophia. I'm a professor of Old Testament here, well, assistant professor. When in hearing your presentation about, you so clearly stated that Vashti evaluated that her dignity was not worth denying, or it was not worth giving up her dignity in order to be an obedient subject or wife, to obey the king's command. So kind of going along the same lines, it's with Esther, where is her dignity at stake? And also, is it to be understood as a collective dignity because of her people?
Yeah. I don't know that it doesn't appear to me that in the narrative, the king puts Esther in a compromising position. I mean, do I think that in general, choosing a wife the way that he did is, yes. But in the story, she's no different than anybody else in that setting, and that's why I would say, unlike Vashti, who's being asked to do something that really is beneath her dignity, Esther's not. And she's very worried the king might kill her, but she's the one that's coming in. So that's where I would say, we're invited to compare and contrast these two women, and I feel like it just helps us better understand each of them, in the story. And I think that Esther's courage is quite remarkable because she knows what can happen if the king is displeased. It can, he goes up like a torch, And so, nevertheless, she plans this out. So I think it's also interesting, your question prompts this in me. For Esther, it's not just about her. And for Vashti, I don't get the sense she's speaking for all women. The men think she's representing all women, but she's just choosing to not do something, immoral, raunchy. So, yeah, thank you.
I invite those in the audience to please ask your questions, so please raise your hand. And just a friendly reminder for those online, please type your question in the comment section, and our own Nate Clayton can ask the question for you here live. Okay. Oh, we have one from Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Kohik. My name is Lee. I'm in seminary here. My question is, I have two daughters, 7 and 10, and I want them to fall in love with the scriptures and with women in the Bible. I think about the ways that I encountered certain women in my youth, and it was sanitized and misinterpreted, grossly misinterpreted, the story of Esther especially. How do we bring the story of Esther and Hagar and Tamar to our daughters so that they can fall in love with the scriptures while also sitting with the realities of really difficult texts?
Yes. Thank you for that question, Lee. Yeah, it is a struggle, and of course, age appropriate, right? And especially because so often part of the plot with women characters involves sexual abuse, or even just like getting married, which is still involves sex in some way. And so that, I think, complicates depending on the age of the women or girls that we're talking with. So, but there is a way, I think, to look at character, to say that she grew into, especially Esther, she grew into her voice, which is good. And your daughters, you know, can grow into their voice. They're not going to be self-confident decision makers at 7 like they will be at 27, you know. But there's a model there of listening well and then acting on that. So that would be one, is character. I think the being able to say that there are certain cultural practices that we don't do anymore and the Bible is not promoting. So it's not okay to objectify women, take girls from their families. This is not, it's not a Cinderella, you know, I get the glass slipper and happily ever after. That's not the picture at all in any of this. So I think the other thing would be to be really clear about the historical reconstruction, that the Bible is not affirming all the cultural outworkings of, you know, the habits, various cultures, including the Israelite, including the culture in the New Testament. So that would be another way to kind of say, you know, in the midst of this, though, Esther decides to take her family and her faith seriously. I mean, now I'm extrapolating, but if they're 7 and 10, that would work. And I think to celebrate Vashti in saying, in even doing some theological imagination, what did Vashti do afterwards? We don't know. But do you think Vashti felt proud of herself, that she wasn't going to play the game of who can be the prettiest, that she wasn't going to let men look at her? And so, yeah, she lost, you know, some maybe comforts, but think how proud she was of herself. What does that feel like? You know, so that'd be another way that I think we could encourage that. And of course, it's not just teaching our girls. The boys need to know this story. They need to understand the love that Mordecai had, the appropriate fear that he had, that his niece might be in danger, that day after day after day being there, making sure she was okay. Those kinds of things I think are really important for boys to grow up thinking. Not that they have to care for girls in a bad way, but in a good way given the cultural situation. Boys and girls have to be a team in this world going forward. Yeah.
Great. Other questions? If I may, maybe because as a corollary to the question that Lee asked, so what are some bad ways we can read Esther? You gave a reception history that was in some ways shocking, but also not surprising. Yeah. And so if we want to read Esther well, what should we not do? A little bit to kind of spin a question off of what Lee just asked.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the one of the things that makes me frustrated, and it'll come out as well in the next paper, is this assumption that the woman's worth is in some way tied to physical appearance. And that is driven home in so many ways to women in our culture and girls in our culture. And we bring that then to the text, and we assume that Esther enjoyed having all these beauty treatments. I personally can't think of anything more boring, than just being lathered and then sit there as it soaks in. I don't know what it was. But I mean, I just think there's no theological imagination that maybe she loved to read. It's when the edict is, Mordecai says, take the edict, to the eunuch, take it to her and show it to her. I don't know if that means that she can read, but what if it does? So, just those kind of, when we have such a flat, like flannel graph expectation for female characters, that it's just all about beauty, it's all about pleasing whoever is around, and it's often men, and that the satisfaction that I should feel is when the other person is happy. That's just not what a fulfilled Imago Dei is. So that would be another, and this is kind of at the level of presuppositions. And then they emerge in ideas that, of course, who wouldn't want to be queen? And then we Disneyfy it. But honestly, I was looking at other pictures and I thought, I can't put this up there. Some of the other pictures. And that's, of course, the other thing, right? Just so sexualized. Vashti and the Marc Chagall painting that was up there. You might have seen that it looks like Vashti was carrying a child. So one of the Hebrew history of interpretation, one is that she's beheaded, but the other, and the reason that she's beheaded is so that she doesn't continue the Persian king line. But then there's another, maybe she had a child, in which case then the Persian line of the king would continue. So I think I think we don't pay attention, so here would be a bad way to read it, is we jump immediately to Mordecai as the central figure, right? Or, and he does play an important role, but he's not the main character. So that would be another thing to be alert to.
We have, I think, 3 questions from online viewers, and so I do think we have time to ask all 3, and
Okay.
then, but that might be it. So that I'm going to hand the microphone to Dr. Clay.
Thank you, by the way, for your presentations. I had a big old hermeneutical question, but I can ask you after.
Okay.
Let's see. Our first question is from Pastor Ryan Chambers. He's Johnson, and he's joining us from Massachusetts. And I'll just read his question. He's wondering about the history of the use of the character of Esther in the church. How often has Esther been used as an exemplar of faith, sidelined, overlooked? Question mark.
Yes, thank you. I think that, so there's one tradition, of course, which is the anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic tradition within the Christian church, and as the letter reflects Purim and that sort of thing, Jewish practices, that would be problematic. So kind of ignored. But in terms of her as a favorable, honestly, she doesn't take up the space that Vashti does. Vashti threatens things with her disobedience. Esther knows what evil is and is able to take care of that. But where some of the rhetorical or the questions that I asked, was she manipulative? Those are the places where Christian commentators would ask maybe some challenging questions. But it's not it doesn't play a real important role. And again, maybe that's because we tend to think of models of discipleship, characters that we should follow are going to be like King David, Moses, they're all men. So how does a man look at Queen Esther and say, these are biblical traits that I should follow and emulate? And, you know, I might as well just turn to Samuel, you know, or somebody like that. And so I think that, to try to get at the pastor's question, I think it's women just aren't seen as useful examples to follow for positive role models. They are often used as what not to do. But so that I think is
Thank you.
yeah.
I'll build on that, just thinking more of the text itself then. And this is a question from Karen Figueroa Galdamez, who I believe is joining us from California on the West Coast. And she simply asked, how would you describe the importance of family systems in the story? Family systems is her question.
Okay, good. So I know just a wee little bit about family systems, enough to wish that somebody else in the audience would answer this question. So if you look at Haman's family, they are not helpful for him. They just feed his ego. Everybody kind of knows where they stand. And then they abandon him when they realize, wow, it's over for him. So I don't know what you call that family system other than really dysfunctional. With Esther and Mordecai, to me, if family systems allow for the growth of a young person into an adult, and with that, some changes in the relationship then I would say that it was healthy, because Mordecai adjusts. He hears what she says, and she's, you know, several years older now, and she also, though, feels comfortable saying to him, you don't understand, I can't go to him, and moreover, I haven't been to him, with him for a month. So it feels to me like, from those wee little bits of data, that they must have had a trusting relationship. She felt he supported her, and of course he did, being there at the palace all the time. She felt he was looking out for her good, and from that then, she could step into her own voice, and he would receive that. So that's, I don't know if I'm using the language, I'm probably not using the language of family system, but that's how I would describe their relationship anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had another question, and I have to look it up now. Here it is. This is from, yeah, I think this will be the last question, and thank you for doing this longer Q&A. This is from Nathaniel Rodriguez, who's a student here at the seminary from afar. He's on the West Coast as well. And his question is, given that Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, I'm assuming that that means that she had to not keep many ceremonial or food laws in order to stay hidden. And his question basically is, what does that part of the story say to original audiences?
Yeah. Well, I had a little note about the book of Daniel, and I took it out. I thought there's only so much one can cover. But that's an excellent observation. So I don't know where the rabbis would go with this, but I should just note that they aren't in the land. So they're diaspora Jews. So that's just something to keep in mind. And at least in the first century, that does matter. Whether it does in her era, you know, I'm not sure. Secondly, Daniel, and I'm just going to use that because that's where a lot of this we have some other incidents or evidence from potentially that time or later. That while Esther had agency in some regard, she didn't have that much. Versus Daniel, who he was known to be a Jew. He's taken with all of that heritage, and his request is, the answer to his request is conditional, based on if he gets this different diet and he doesn't seem healthy, then we're going back to the meat and potatoes. And so that whole, all of the assumptions around that story just don't seem to fit with Esther. I don't know if she did ritual purity with her menstrual cycle. That would be another one. Daniel doesn't have to worry about that, so we don't know about that in the story. And I don't know enough, or if there's enough evidence to really know if she kept that practice. But that would almost seem like you could kind of do that, and the eunuchs aren't going to know, you know. So maybe there were things that she did that expressed her Jewishness that she could kind of do in private and that she could have control over, versus the food that she wouldn't necessarily have control over. I don't know.
Can we give Dr. Koch a hand? I am reminded from her presentation how the moral responsibility of reading the biblical text well and faithfully, for me, it becomes more salient after your lecture, so thank you. We are now going to take a break, and what I want to do is invite people online. Please come back for session 2. We will have a 30-minute break, so that means at 5:45 Pacific Standard Time, 7:45 Chicago time, and 8:45 East Coast time, we will start session 2 on 1 Peter. Thank you. And those of you who are here, we have refreshments, so please, yes. So enjoy the refreshments that online people can only experience vicariously.
this thing too.
Yes.
Even Hannah, but first just about it.
Yeah.
Let's remember. I'll forget. Will you remember?
Okay. Yes. I was taking pictures. I jumped the gun. I jumped the gun. I did not. I just have like a little bit of a heel. I could. I like hiding behind this. I jumped the gun because like, I always am afraid of being late.
Oh. Well, they gave them a lot of time. They gave a lot of time for students.
Yeah. I really like your shirt and your earrings.
You know what's funny is that I come here to take care of my mom, and all I brought was like jeans and everything, so these are actually my mother's clothes.
Oh, wow.
I know. So I was like, well, I'm glad my mom has some things that fit me. She's
Yeah, yeah. That's awesome. And that was an excellent question. Yeah.
I find it really interesting.
I was gonna dovetail, but I just was like, okay, I don't want to take more time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's just fun to hear about.
Huh?
I taught a class on women in the Bible, and it's just so interesting how there's so much more about women in the Bible than you would think.
Yes.
It's just not true.
Exactly. Oh, that's so wonderfully put. You're right on the dot. You hit it right, the nail right on the head.
Yeah, I'm glad you're. Are you introducing the next?
Yeah, I'm just gonna introduce
Okay.
it. Yeah, and then moderate the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How are you enjoying teaching?
Oh, I love it because students are so much more engaged than what I'm used to.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just taught a couple classes here, but I found students
Yeah.
very interested in, it's easy to get a good discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Welcome, everyone, to the second session. Welcome back to the 2025 Lund Lecture, entitled For Such a Time as This, Women's Resiliency in the Bible. Our second session, I'm Sofia Magallanes Sang. Okay. I'm just going to wait for everybody to come back in. Welcome back to session 2 of the 2025 Lund Lecture for such a time as this with Dr. Lynn Cohick. And Her second session is entitled First Peter and the Wife of Bath in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Resiliency from the Most Unlikely Places. So will you join me in welcoming Dr. Cohick?
Thank you to whoever decided it would be a good idea for cookies. Thank you. Well, we explored the agency of two queens in the Persian Empire, noticing that their range of decisions included refusing a husband or king's command, modifying a male cousin's command, and persuading a husband, king, to reverse his previous command. I'd like to focus on a New Testament text with close exegesis and attention to historical background. This would be 1 Peter 3. And then I'd like to talk about another wife, the wife of Bath, in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, as a possible expression of what Peter might have imagined, or what women today imagine Peter might have imagined as living out his words. And I realize that sentence probably needs wordsmithing. But my point is just that, it's Canterbury Tales is going to, I think, allow us to imagine 1 Peter 3 maybe in a different way. The wife of Bath in her tale speaks of honor and submission, even as 1 Peter focuses on those same virtues. And her story is about marriage. But the wife of Bath starts her tale with a rape. I can't speak about marriage without the misunderstandings and the abuses that society and sadly even the church have sanctioned down through the ages and continue to do so. So to start our conversation, I wanted to reflect on a current story that happened recently in France. There was the public trial of Dominique Pellicot, who drugged his wife, Giselle, and then invited 80 men, I think was one figure that I saw, to assault her. 50 men have been charged. The defense by some men is that the husband has the right to do this. One defendant said, it's his wife. He does what he wants with her. Another was more circumspect, saying, well, he's not a rapist because he did not come upon this woman on the street and force himself on her. Giselle the wife chose to move forward with legal charges Declaring shame must change sides. That's what you see on the slide. Shame must change sides. Shame changes sides. This is what happens with the knight in the wife of Bath's tale. Her story offers one way to think about Peter's call to the church, to husbands and wives. So as we turn to wives in Peter's congregation who are married to unbelieving husbands, we should remember that wives at this time in the Roman period, they did have some agency, and it was usually tied to their social status and wealth. They could own property, they could travel, they could even separate from their husbands, but they could not divorce independent of having a male guardian sign any paperwork in the courts. So here you can see the material, the passage that I'll be talking about. Peter charges the wife by inviting the reader to look back to what has already been said in the same way. And you actually have to go back to chapter 2, verse 13, where the congregation is commanded to submit, hupotasso, to every human authority. Additionally, Peter commands that they honor everyone, and specifically that they honor the emperor. I think it's worth pausing for a moment to see why believers are enjoined to submit. First, they do so to silence the talk of foolish people, those who claim that believers did not, in fact, honor government leaders. Secondly, such submission shows the true face of injustice and harsh, wicked people, such as the crooked slave owners. It shows that those harsh, wicked people will be condemned. And finally, submission of this sort models Christ's behavior, who submitted to and endured suffering, knowing that his persecutors would be judged. These details matter as we find that within church history up to the present day, wives are told that they are to bear their suffering, abuse from their husbands, as an act of faithfulness. Ruth Ann Rees strongly and rightly objects to such interpretations. Quote, "If these phrases and instructions are read from a position of power and privilege, they can also be read in such a way that obedience to the master is no longer a form of faithfulness to the Lord and resistance to the ways of the world, but rather a way of reinforcing the status quo submission of slaves to masters. The call to imitate Christ in doing good, even if one suffers for it, is for all believers. This passage condemns those who use violence, whether against Christ in his passion or against his sheep." Karen Jobes states succinctly, quote, "There is nothing in this passage of Scripture that would either sanction the abuse of wives or suggest that women should continue to submit themselves to that kind of treatment," end quote. I would also like to take just a moment and also comment on verbal participles. And in hindsight, knowing the people present in the room, I wish I had just blocked this out. But I'm going to go forward, and then I'll learn something in the question and answer time. So in 2:18 and in 3:1, Peter uses the participle form of hupotasso, linking it back to the imperative in 2:13, that command, that imperative of submission that is commanded to all believers. Most commentaries say that here in 3:1, we have the use of an imperatival participle. I'm going to suggest that there might be a different option. First of all, I would just note that in the Cambridge Classical Greek Grammar, there is no category called the imperatival participle. But then second, I turn to Stephen Runge's discussion about participles in his work on discourse and grammar. He remarks that participles are chosen by the author so that the finite or the main verb receives the most attention. Additionally, he looks at 1 Peter earlier, chapter 1, verse 14, a verse often pointed to in commentaries as an example of the rare imperatival participle. And he reminds us that a participle indicates additional information, not the main action. He indicates that Peter's choice of the aorist passive imperative to be, with the noun holy there in chapter 1, verse 15, is the primary action demanded by the author. Verse 14's participle sets the stage by describing the before picture, which is the antithesis of what a holy person looks like. So Runge looks at our passage in a footnote, and he indicates that the participle here, submitting, draws on the aorist passive command to submit back in chapter 2, verse 13. If nothing else, this little side comment about the participle is meant to encourage you to recognize that submit is a posture that Peter enjoins all believers to show and is not specific to the female. Peter encourages wives to show their agency in several ways. First, their behaviors seek to persuade their husbands to leave their pagan, ancestral religious customs and become a believer in the word, the gospel message. In these actions, the Christian wives subvert social customs which dictate that wives follow their husbands' gods, including offering libations to the family hearth. Plutarch comments that wives should worship their husbands' gods and should welcome his friends. David Balch points out the likelihood that these husbands are among the number who actively condemn the gospel. And Karen Jobes adds that these cultural practices threaten the Christian wife, who could be blamed for rebelling against her family and community and forming friendships outside of her husband's circles. Additionally, Jobes writes, quote, "The husband would also feel embarrassment and suffer criticism for not properly managing his household," end quote. Peter does not list specific actions to be done by wives, but rather offers the attitude and demeanor which accompanies that behavior. As wives are submitting to their husbands, they are free to act as they think best. Job's notes here. They, quote, "have a measure of moral responsibility and choice unprecedented in Greek thought," end quote. So too, Queen Esther develops her plan to convince the king to overturn Haman's evil decree, not following directly Mordecai's orders to head straight into an audience with the king. Furthermore, implied by Peter is the wife's freedom to say no to unethical or immoral requests, similar to Vashti's refusal to be treated as a concubine. Indeed, no woman should be objectified. Balch points to an example in Musonius, who concludes that a son may disobey his father if his father refused to allow him to study philosophy. And when I saw that, I thought, it just doesn't work today, like how many sons are desperate to study philosophy. Anyway, I digress. So too, the wife is not to submit to orders that compromise her virtues. Wives reflect their hidden heart or self, the heart of the anthropos, the human heart, that shows an imperishable, gentle, and quiet spirit. There is no mention of physical beauty here. The translation adds "your beauty" in verse 3, and then beauty after unfading in verse 4. But that adjective, I would suggest, is better translated as immortal or imperishable. Peter's focus is on countering the antagonism of the husband in a godly way. There is no specific mention of physical beauty in this text. The only nod to something beautiful is the adornment that the woman would put on, either jewels or things in her hair or her clothing. Balch emphasizes the ancient philosopher's call to meet slander with silence. For example, Plutarch stresses that one should maintain silence as a dignified, calm posture when one is reviled. Now, that sounds really good for Plutarch, but full disclosure, you read that his whole point to the end. Plutarch concludes, quote, "If you once acquire the habit of bearing an enemy's abuse in silence, you will very easily bear up under a wife's attack when she rails at you." Plutarch. In his final thought, we see not only the prevalent sexism and the assumptions at play, but also we can actually see if he's telling in any way some kind of historical reality, which I'm not necessarily willing to give him, but he sets this up. Let's assume the families he knows has this dynamic. Then should the Christian wife not act like constantly railing against the husband, but instead show a calm silence? Well, then her calm silence would be even more magnified in this context, right? Because she's supposed to be irritatingly noisy. Because physical beauty is emphasized in the book of Esther, I want to just emphasize again, 1 Peter does not contrast physical beauty with inner beauty. Wives are to eschew sumptuous clothing, jewelry, hairstyles, the gold hairnets. That which holds value to God is their inner heart reflecting in the incorruptible, meek, and peaceful spirit in imitation of Christ. And then Peter draws the example from the Israelite matriarchs. I think that's the best way to understand this reference to holy women. And he draws specifically on the example of Sarah. Now, the Old Testament does not speak of any of these women, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, as submitting to their husbands. So you're not going to find that in a word search. But we do find Philo allegorizing them as examples of virtue for his readers. And so it may be that Peter is drawing on a more recent interpretation and follows Philo's lead, using Sarah as an idealized wife for a particular context. Only twice does Scripture say that Sarah obeyed Abraham, and in both cases, it was when Abraham told her to claim to be his sister, giving the impression that she was not his wife. Sarah faced danger from two different unbelieving spouses. You can see this in Genesis 12 and also in Genesis 20. In both cases, the deception was discovered before any direct harm came to Sarah. But we should not minimize the danger Sarah faced of being alone among a foreign people, subject to a husband who could be antagonistic. Peter may be alluding to this context. Ruth Ann Reese, in her commentary, suggests that in our text, quote, women who have courageously chosen a dangerous path, this path is conversion to a foreign minority religion that their husbands have not chosen. These women are reminded that Sarah also faced danger when she obeyed her husband, end quote. And as Joel Green wisely notes, Peter is well aware that concern with the inner person need not shield people from present abuse, end quote. Peter concludes to these believing wives that they are Sarah's daughters if they do what is right and not give way to fear. But that concluding participle, do what is right, I think is not conditional, but logical. These women have their identity in Christ. It's not that their identity is contingent on doing what is right and being brave. Rather, because they are Sarah's daughters, they are able to do what is right without fear. The picture drawn by Peter is of a wife who knows her theology so well, she can enact it on a daily basis. She has nobility, integrity, self-control, and that speaks volumes to her husband. She becomes his model of behavior. He looks to her for wisdom and character. He's attracted to be with her. She has a compellingly likable demeanor. He'd rather be with her than not. He sees her bravery magnified in the face of the power that society has given him over her. He's persuaded that her way is the right way, and he learns from her the way of godly perfection. As I researched 1 Peter, I tried to imagine how Peter might have envisioned his teachings playing out. Like, what events did he think would happen when the husband was won over to his wife's faith? What does it look like for a husband to be convinced by his wife? Did Peter figure that the husband would like secretly admire his wife's faith and then head to church one Sunday and speak to the male senior pastor about what was really going on with this Christianity stuff? So as I was pondering this question, I listened to a history podcast called The Rest is History with Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook. And their podcast was on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Specifically, they looked at The Wife of Bath's prologue and tale, which I had read way back in high school, and, you know, I liked it. But as they were describing it, I was really drawn to her experience and the story as Chaucer tells it. And I thought, maybe this provides a narrative answer to my question. So, turning to Wife of Bath. You know, sometimes you don't know how dangerous the current is until you get right out there in the middle of the creek. In my case, I had no idea how fraught Chaucer studies could be until a medievalist friend looked at me with true horror when I said, "Oh, I want to explore the Wife of Bath and 1 Peter," and like she just blanched. And then a similar experience with the second friend. This one is in English literature. But, you know, I'm going to proceed where angels and smart people fare to tread. So using my excuse, hey, I'm just a scholar of the New Testament. In addition to that important caveat, we should also be aware that Chaucer's work set new horizons, and it broke old norms for storytelling, especially in the area of character. Marion Turner remarks, quote, "This sustained experiment in the invention of character is something wholly new in English literature," end quote. And she goes on to add that the Wife of Bath, about the Wife of Bath story particularly, quote, "Chaucer takes a story that is, at its heart, about male virtue and heroism, and turns it into a story about female virtue, ethics, the need for men to be educated and reformed, metamorphosis, female desire, and rape culture," end quote. Finally, I should note that both the prologue and the tale focus on the broad question of what women desire. This is a fascinating question, but one for another day. My very limited focus is on the final scene of the tale, the wedding night of the hag and the knight, highlighting the conversation and conversion. So Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in 1380. The Black Death had hit England in 1348 and then came back with a vengeance in 1361 and 62. They estimate up to 50% of the population died. That's about 6 million of the 13 million in Britain. So half the laborers are dead, the remainder are left to work the fields. The laborers wanted more money, landowners resisted, and the peasants' revolt occurred in 1381. This is the world of the Wife of Bath, known as Alison. She's of the merchant class, and she grew wealthy off the wool trade and inheritances from her husbands, as wives typically got about 30% of their husband's wealth. So the Wife of Bath, her prologue is quite long. It's 1,264 lines. It's the most extensive of all the prologues spoken by the characters. She's also the only non-clerical female in this band of pilgrims that's heading to Canterbury. She married her first husband at age 12 and had been married 5 times. The first 3 husbands were older and wealthy. The 4th one was not so nice, so she says she tormented him by pretending she was unfaithful. But she married her 5th husband, Jenkin, for love, and she gave her inheritance to him, and then pretty quickly regretted it. He was abusive. He'd read this book about wicked wives to her, and one evening she grabbed some pages, tossed them into the fire. He punched her so hard she was permanently deaf in one ear, and she fell down as though dead. He thought he had killed her, and he was distraught. He apologized, and she required that an agreement going forward was that she's to have all the control again of her house and her land and her wealth. The wife of Bath speaks of having the mastery, the sovereignty, as her husband said to her, "Do as you please the rest of all thy life, guard thy honor and my reputation." And the wife of Bath says they never had another argument. She was kind to him and faithful. And yes, he did burn the book called The Wicked Wives. The wife of Bath displays baldy, coarse humor. She's comfortable in her own skin. She has no reservations about speaking about the joys of sex. She admits to being a chatterbox, and she speaks her mind. And she does have a mind. It's very clever. She turns the clerics' arguments on their head. You know, at this time, marriage was seen as second best after virginity, but she uses Jesus' miracle at the wedding of Cana to show that Jesus was fine with marriage. In other words, our wife of Bath recognizes that interpretation plays a large role in the church's conclusions about proper doctrine and proper behaviors. And she rightly points out that sometimes these interpretations advantage men over women or wives. And here's a quote. "By God, if women had written stories as clerks or clerics have within their studies, they would have written of men more wickedness than all the male sex could set right." She develops the epistemological question, whether and to what extent is our knowledge based on authority and on experience. And she turns clerics' arguments on their head as she explores the role of experience and authority in exegesis. Luminaries such as Augustine and Jerome, with their exegetical moves from literal to spiritual and figural, bury the truth that they relied in part on subjectivity and experience. And the wife of Bath challenges the claim by exegetes, but she retains her reverence for Scripture. In other words, the wife of Bath recognizes that interpretation plays a large role in the church's conclusions about proper doctrine and proper behavior. Turner remarks, quote, "In giving a literary voice to a much married woman, a voice that did not simply ventriloquize straightforward misogyny, Chaucer created a literary space for a figure who was socially central in his world, but textually marginalized," end quote. So rather than accuse her of mishandling Scripture, although her conclusions wouldn't necessarily pass an exegesis assignment, I think we need to evaluate her argument that experience informs authoritative claims. In fact, Robert Longsworth locates her crucial point, quote, "Authority, for all its power, is susceptible to treachery," end quote. As important and enjoyable as the prologue and the tale are, my focus is on the final scene, the marriage bed. But first, a brief recap of the tale. It's the time of King Arthur and his queen Guinevere. It is the chivalrous age of knights jousting and competing in tournaments, but our story starts with a terrible event. A knight is on his way back from hawking, sees a maiden, and rapes her. The description is minimal. It's just, despite all she could do, by utter force, he took away her maidenhead. He is sentenced to death by the king. However, the queen begs the king to pardon him on one condition: that the knight give the queen the correct answer to the question, "What thing is it that women most desire?" He has a year and a day to get the answer. Well, as you can imagine, he gets all kinds of unsatisfactory answers, but on the final day, he meets an old hag. She will give him the answer if he then grants her one request, which he agrees to do because he thinks he knows what the request will entail. He's confident he could very well repay her. You know, he's got money. So off they go to court, where the queen is ready to hear his answer. And the knight pronounces, "My liege lady, without exception, women desire to have sovereignty as well over her husband as her love, and to be in mastery above him." The answer is accepted, and the knight's life is saved. However, now the knight's education really begins. he now faces an unanticipated peril. The old hag requires that he marry her and love her. He faces his own shame in having to marry an old, ugly commoner. Catherine McKinley rightly observes, quote, "This second quest is a purely internal spiritual one. The knight must solve a second riddle, but this time only at the cost of personal change," end quote. I'm reminded here of Ruth Ann Reese's critique in her First Peter commentary against those who read the apostle from a position of power. Quote, "Those with privilege expect submission to the emperors or to masters. This is the way things are. The inferior submits to the superior. The ignoble submit to the noble." And the knight holds tightly to this view. And of course, First Peter condemns it. The knight begs the crone to change her request. "Take all my goods and let my body go." Was that the plea given by the maiden? The old, ugly woman refuses, but asks him, why is he so reluctant? He declares her poverty and her low social status would degrade him, but he must marry her. So quietly in the morning he does, and then he hides away all day. Finally, night falls and they go to bed. He's tossing and turning and struggling to just remove himself from this bed of misery. And the old woman, now his wife, asks again, why is he so sorrowful and agitated? And he answers some of the sweetest words that a husband has ever said to his wife. "Thou art so loathsome, so old also, and moreover descended from such low-born lineage." Hallmark card quality. He said, "I wish I would die." Well, not to worry, she says. She can fix this. And then she mentions before 3 days passed, which is a gesture to Christ's own promise to raise up his body. And then this allusion begins a catechesis on virtue that is a tour de force. In this extensive section in her lecture, she mentions Dante, Philarius, Seneca, Boethius, and I'll paraphrase here the hag's first point. So she says, "You call yourself a nobleman, but what is real nobility? Nobility does not grow from a family tree, but it is the fruit of each person's life. Nobility is not external with rich robes, fancy armor, a horse, and servants. No one inherits the virtue of nobility, for it is forged in obedience to Christ." Here's a line from the text. "Christ wants us to claim our nobility from him. True nobility comes from God, from his grace." Tackling next his disdain of her poverty, and again I paraphrase, "So, you call yourself rich, but what are true riches but life in Christ? Jesus himself was poor, and he sanctified such a life." In fact, she adds, "He who covets is a poor person." Poverty makes one know God all the more and reveals one's true friends. Finally, the old wife says, and here again I paraphrase, "Yes, I'm old, but are you not to respect age?" And she reminds him that as a knight, he would know that he is to treat an older person with honor. Now, in this lengthy pillow talk, the crone shows that she knows what true Christian virtue is. I think she articulates what 1 Peter talks about, a discipleship that's not gendered or sexed, but human virtue that evangelizes an unbelieving husband, an errant knight. She offers a tutorial on Christian virtue. And then, like any good teacher, she offers a test question at the end. And it's not, can you love an ugly old woman? She asks him, do you want a young and beautiful wife who might make you a cuckold, or an old, faithful wife? The reader understands this is a trick question, for it's based on the non-virtuous parameters that the knight has used up to this point. It's important to stop here because Chaucer does. The knight takes a long moment, he debates within himself, he sighs deeply, and then, with a twist in the story, he suggests a third option. I put me in your wise governance. So she asks for clarification. I have the mastery and I can govern as I please? He confirms, yes, wife, certainly. I consider it best. The knight's response to her question answers the test as to whether he is willing to change his viewpoint, to see virtue as his wife declared, drawing on the church's teaching and scripture. He recognizes that her two options are the ones he came into marriage with, but his answer shows that he now views her and marriage very differently. His answer proves that he heard his wife's wisdom and argument for virtue. Anne McTaggart puts it succinctly, quote, in her speech, the old woman says in effect, do not look at me as an object that either succeeds or fails to meet your desire for beauty and status. Rather, look at me as a model of virtue and true gentility, end quote. I think the unbelieving husband in 1 Peter 3 might say the same to his believing wife. He noticed her nobility, her good character. He desired such for himself. Perhaps one night he turns to her in the bed and asks her how such purity and holiness, such sense of well-being and deep joy might be his as well. And here she would speak, answering with the gospel message that is outlined in 1 Peter. Bear with me just a little bit longer. The wife of Bath's tale isn't finished yet. The knight husband gives the right answer to her. However, her response has angered many contemporary feminist readers. The hag wife says that because he answered well, she will be to him both fair and good, both good and true. And most readers assume she changes her physical appearance as a capitulation to Chaucer's patriarchal environment. But Chaucer indicates in the story, there's a curtain that's been between them. I'm trying to visualize, and I really can't, but they can't see each other as she has been talking. do him pleasure or enjoyment. And this picture that she paints harkens back to 1 Corinthians 7:4, which the wife of Bath had referred to in the prologue. To the Corinthians, as you know, Paul talks about the husband and the wife fulfilling their debt to their spouse. And in her day, they called it debt. Each owed a debt to the other, to have sex with each other. And if the husband refused his wife's request for sex, then the church technically allowed divorce, although it wasn't always granted. But there's this idea of debt. The wife of Bath is aware of Jerome's argument in favor of virginity and his drumbeat, that it's better for a man not to touch a woman. But she draws on Paul's statement a few verses later, it's better to marry than to burn, concluding that her path of several marriages was in line with scripture authority. And so this, I think we draw back when she says to do him pleasure or enjoyment, we're invited to go back to the prologue and see how she describes in her own marriage this pleasure and enjoyment where they're at one and they're in harmony, but not because she obeys, quote unquote, in everything. The wife of Bath's tale puts into story form what 1 Peter 3 sketches in his epistle, or at least that's the idea I'm playing with here. In both cases, wives demonstrate Christian virtue, which includes eschewing wealth and social prestige as the highest goods. The poor, ignoble crone instructs the knight, while the believing wife models an incorruptible, pure, and humble character. Both seek their husband's transformation towards a godly life. Both demonstrate agency in pursuing the goal of changing their husband's mind and character. The believing wife in 1 Peter 3 must be resilient, staying the course for the long haul. She shows character, and she must cope with the challenges brought by living in a household with an unbelieving husband. The wife of Bath offers a cheeky view of resilience, I think. She doesn't lose her sense of humor, and she seeks control through good decision-making. So I return to the question at the start of both papers. What is a good wife? Maybe one who uses her agency to promote honor of women, Vashti, Allison. How about one who displays resilience in her character and contribution to her community, Esther, and the wife in 1 Peter 3. Each of us is on a pilgrimage. We're on a journey that we hope shows ever greater likeness to Christ. I think each of these women, each of these biblical women, are worthy companions for us as we travel on our way. Thank you.
We are now invited to engage with the presentations from the first and second session. So if you have a question or a comment or any point of engagement, please raise your hand and I'll come to you. Also, those who are online, you're invited to type out your questions and comments in the chat.
So my question, Max Lee, I teach New Testament here at North Park. I wanted to ask, in the examples you gave in both the first session and the second session, women were in social structures where the power differential clearly favored men. So, they were disempowered, and in a disempowered environment, how can they engage men who had power? Just wondering if, are there modes in the Bible where we could think if women had more power, would they engage the men differently? That's something that's the first question that came in my mind, because both in 1 Peter 3 and also in the Esther narrative, it seems like the power differential is so skewed that in a position of powerlessness, this is what these characters could do to regain their agency.
Yeah.
And maybe when we apply it, the concern I have is that if women do have more agency now than they did in the past, they would use that agency, and perhaps these texts speak more loudly to parts of the world where the structures of society put agency predominantly in men's hands in an overbearing way. So I just want to know if you comment on that.
Sure, thank you. So I'll talk about the more agency, and then I'll get back to, I have two thoughts on this. Hopefully I'll retain both of them, because it's late for me. First thing, I would say that when you look at how Jesus engages theologically with women, the Samaritan woman, Mary Magdalene at the tomb, they are given theologically rich information, and there develops, certainly with Mary Magdalene, a disciple-master kind of appropriate relationship that he would also have with the male disciples. And so there, I would say, Jesus creates a movement where you have men and women functioning together equally as disciples. I would point to Dale Allison and his new book, Interpreting Jesus, especially in chapter 4, where he dives into this question of itinerant women disciples who travel with Jesus around in Galilee. I think he makes a very strong argument. So that would be one. Second, in Paul's communities, of course, we think of Priscilla and Aquila. They seem to model what little we have, the information that we have. They seem to be a non-competitive, mutuality-driven marriage. And in that context, then, they teach, they set up house churches. Same with Phoebe, being someone who is Paul's, is part of Paul's leadership team, in one way or another, part of the leadership team in the Church of Cancrea. And so, from the biblical text, we see women who lead in spaces where there are men. They do so because they are gifted spiritually, is where I would say probably that comes. And then secondarily, probably because they have financial wherewithal. I mean, if you're wealthy, you would have been educated probably a little bit more. And if you're wealthy and people expect you to serve important functions, you grow up just knowing how to do that. One of the things of poverty can take away someone's sense of self, and no one pays attention to you anyway. So it's not like I'm saying the church promoted wealthy people because they were wealthy. It's not that, but just that when you have wealth, there are expectations placed on you that include public leadership in certain ways. And so I think that and the spiritual calling, gifting, spiritual gifts, those would be what's going on. Having said all of that, now jumping to today, we do educate women here at North Park University and universities that I've taught at. We have no problem, most of the time, no problem having them do their undergrad, graduate. We don't mind if women occupy the C-suite, that they're surgeons, attorneys, leaders in countries. We tend not to mind that, more or less, with things. However, I would say within the evangelical community, there can be a comfort with that, but in the home, there is a expectation of, and they'll use the word headship, which is actually not a biblical term. Head and body are metaphors in Scripture, but there's a principle called headship that is developed from a certain track of exegesis. And so I would say that actually, 1 Peter's I feel like that can be a contemporary experience of a lot of women today, because there's a sense that in the home it works this way, and when I go to work, I can have all kinds of people report to me, but when I go home, that's not the case. Or when I enter into church, the expectation is that I'll take care of kids, even if I'm, the head of a big bank. I'm not going to be on the finance committee at church. So I feel like you are absolutely right that women they have more agency in a lot of spaces, but not all. And I think what we're finding today, and what some of the social sciences are discovering, is that women are very frustrated with trying to live in those spaces. Because it just doesn't feel authentic. They know what they can do, and in certain places they have to just shrink. Yeah.
Just one comment. So thank you for mentioning one comment. Thank you for mentioning in the very beginning that this is wives toward their unbelieving husbands,
Yes.
because I think many people read these household codes and they automatically think that this is a Christian model for a Christian household, but these are pagan social institutions. And the only Christian institution that's talked about explicitly in the Bible is the church. And the church, as you mentioned, should be a place like Jesus, where we're creating structures where agency of women are promoted, not diminished.
Yes.
And you can't do anything about the pagan world, especially if the husband's an unbeliever and it's a patriarchal society.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
We have some questions online.
Yeah, I have a couple from our online audience. The first is actually from Lynn Nixon, who is our affiliate New Testament faculty, and she comes from Tucson, Arizona. And she is asking you, Dr. Kohik, at the beginning you spoke of 7 C's, and you talked about contribution to the community with regard to Esther. Her question is there another C or 2 that stand out to you for the others?
Yeah, and I'll pull those up. Thank you for drawing on that. So the C's were competence, confidence, connection to others, character, contribution to the group, coping with challenges, and control of outcomes through good decisions. I would say, in talking about 1 Peter, coping with challenges would be one of the 7 C's that I see with that wife. The challenge of trying to be faithful to God and to negotiate a very pagan environment in the home. The wife's responsibility in terms of the religious activities in the home, they were enormously important. The libation that you would give before your evening meal, or the training of the children in doing whatever festival might be coming up. And I struggled with even using the term religious, because it suggests that there's religion over here and then there's other things. This is a fabric. You pull one thread and the whole thing can unravel. So I would say coping with challenges. And Peter figures that she can figure it out. Like, there's not rules, do this, don't do that. It's like, be like Jesus. and you will draw, you could, can't promise that, but you could actually draw interest that way. But you're capable of incredible influence. And in that way, then, I would say 1 Peter also, she contributes to the group in the sense of the whole church. We're all to be evangelizing in one way or another, so she's contributing in that. I would say with Vashti, one of the C's is character. And I do think she puts that front and center in the importance of of maintaining one's dignity and honor. I would say, I think I mentioned, but Esther, if I didn't, you see her growth of confidence. And I think that is really helpful. There's years that pass in her story that we see. I would like to think that 1 Peter, in writing what he does, is hoping that those wives of unbelieving husbands would gain in confidence, because what he's writing is incredibly encouraging and empowering to them. We just haven't seen it that way because we get tangled up in this whole beauty thing. Yeah, so that would be, I think, where I would go with those.
And the second online question comes from Nathaniel Rodriguez, again, who's one of our students on the West Coast. First, he really wants to let you know that you rock. So Dr. Kohik rocks. So.
Thank you.
And his question is, if in 1 Peter 3, Peter is talking to wives of unbelieving husbands, why then use the Sarah and Abraham dynamic, when Abraham wouldn't have been thought of as an unbelieving spouse, even if his lack of faith is evident and is asking Sarah to pretend to be his sister? His second part of the question is, how and when do you think Peter would have advised a quote-unquote Sarah not to obey a quote-unquote Abraham?
Okay, yeah. I think what Peter, I'll take that second question first. I think Peter would, and thank you for your compliment too. I think Peter would have cautioned anyone against idolatry, straight up idolatry. I think in stating at the very end that you are her daughters, because, you stand firm and you don't give way to fear. Twice in the ending there's two different terms for fear. He's really emphasizing the danger, I think, that she's in. And I wonder if part of that, because this letter is read aloud, if the community, as they hear this read, are alerted to their responsibility within the community to be especially mindful of how they can help and not create problems for their sister who's married to sister in Christ who's married to an unbeliever. How can they help her not create struggles? Peter knows that some of the believers will be physically harmed by unbelievers. He doesn't condone it. In mentioning that Christ also experienced this, he makes it clear that Christ knows that God judges justly, that God is watching, that there will be judgment happening. And I think I don't know very much about trauma-informed reading, but from what I understand, if the community around, let's say, this believing wife who is facing many struggles with her unbelieving husband, if the community around her says, we believe you, and we love you, and we support you, that makes a tremendous difference in the healing of the trauma that she faces. And of course, it's not just her. There are also slaves, potentially household slaves in the community. And I mean, they're a minority, a very small minority that can be taken advantage of just in general. Oh, it's a sobering text to read, but I think we have to also acknowledge that for Peter, there isn't at this point a recourse of someone stronger that could protect them all. They're all really vulnerable. And so he says, but you know what? God sees all of this. You have this shepherd, this overseer of your faith. You are my sheep. I will take care of you. So I'm trying to kind of answer what I think sadly is that he recognizes maybe some of these women will face actual danger in this, but he is not in any way excusing it. But it's just more of a, this is the reality. I hope I was grabbing at the question there that was asked.
Are there any questions in the room? I would like to just echo the last question about Sarah and the matriarchs as exemplars.
Oh, yes, that was the other part. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, that is curious, why he picks up Sarah there. And that's why I like Ruth Ann Reese's suggestion that it's these moments that Sarah faces where she is in a space, in like direct pagan. I mean, you know, she's not with her people in the same way that this believing wife is not really with her people now in this new context. And otherwise, it's not really clear why. I like Ruth Ann Reese's argument because I don't know, but maybe Dr. Edwards put you on this spot.
That's fine. I don't always see it.
In your commentary, here's the commentary on 1 Peter.
Yeah,
So.
but I see it as, I mean, consistently Peter is appealing to the Old Testament and pulling this community into Israel's story. So I see it as appealing to women, virtuous women of the Old Testament, to pull them into the story. And so it would be a reasonable place to go. I mean, that's the way I think of it.
Yes, and people would have known her story, right? I mean, it's not an obscure text. They would have known that. And the interesting thing is that she obeys him in those two circumstances. Yeah.
And I think that the answer to the other piece of his question actually goes, as you're describing this, God does, in both instances where she's passed off as his sister, does intervene on her behalf.
He does. Yeah. And again, Peter can't promise that exact outcome, but it is one of hope. And I mean, 1 Peter is a very hopeful letter the whole way through. So I think that, you're absolutely right.
Thank you so much for your paper. Will you join me now in thanking our Dr. Kowick? And I would like to invite Dr. Edwards, Dean Edwards, to lead us in prayer.
Well, once again, we are grateful, Dr. Kowick, for you sharing your expertise and experience with us. I mean, it's been enriching. We're really grateful. Thank you. Let's stand together. Right? Dear God, we give you thanks for your goodness and for who you are. And Lord, you've gotten us thinking about your children, particularly our sisters from way back, and the lessons that we can learn. We appreciate so much, Lord, hearing about the resilience, the resiliency, the way that our sisters have persevered, and how we can learn and grow. So I pray, Lord, you continue to teach us and move us to the places we ought to be, and that we would continue to listen to our sisters. I pray, Lord, for us to have safe travels home tonight, that we'd be able to rest well. And we pray for your blessings, particularly on Dr. Kowick as she travels back to Texas, and that you would bless her in her ministry there as well. We give thanks in the name of Jesus. Amen.